The courtroom was packed, tense, and ready to decide a man's fate. Ethan Marlowe sat alone at the defense table, his future hanging by a thread when something unthinkable happened. His lawyer stepped away. Murmurs spread. Smirks followed. Then from the very back of the room, a small black girl stood up. Her clothes were worn. Her voice barely rose above the crowd. "I can defend him." Laughter echoed through the courtroom, until seconds later the room fell into absolute silence. What did Alicia Walker know that no one else did? Comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And subscribe for more powerful stories that demand to be heard. Long before anyone noticed her inside that federal courtroom, Alicia Walker had already learned what it meant to be overlooked. She lived in a part of the city most people only mentioned in passing, a neighborhood shaped by closed factories, overcrowded schools, and promises that never seemed to arrive. Every afternoon, while other kids rushed home to television screens and noise, Alicia walked quietly beside her grandmother, Claire Walker, carrying groceries up narrow staircases and listening to stories about how hard life used to be, and how hard it still was. Alicia was young, but she was observant. She noticed how teachers spoke slower to her than to others, how adults assumed her silence meant ignorance. At school, she finished her work early and spent long stretches staring out the window, absorbing patterns, how people behaved, who was listened to, and who was dismissed. She asked questions that made people uncomfortable, and over time, she learned which questions not to ask out loud. At the same time, across the city, Ethan Marlowe was living a life built on recognition. As the founder of a powerful technology company, he had grown accustomed to rooms quieting when he entered and people nodding when he spoke. Yet that morning, seated in a courtroom surrounded by polished wood and cold marble, Ethan Marlowe felt something unfamiliar: helplessness. His company, his reputation, and his freedom were under attack, and the system he once trusted now felt distant and unforgiving. Presiding over the case was Justice Rosalind Anderson, known for her strict adherence to procedure and order. The courtroom reflected her presence, controlled, formal, and unmoved by emotion. Nearby stood Garrett Doyle, the prosecutor, confident and composed, representing the full weight of the state. To him, this case was already decided. In the gallery, Landon Jefferson watched quietly. As an investigator, he had learned that truth did not always align with appearances. Patterns mattered, and something about this case unsettled him, even if he couldn't yet explain why. And then there was Veronica Cross, calm and composed, sitting where power usually sat. She looked like someone who belonged there, someone no one would question. No one, that is, except a young black girl in worn clothes sitting silently in the back row, already sensing that what was about to unfold was bigger than one man on trial. Something was coming, and when it did, it would force everyone in that room to confront what they believed about justice, race, and who was allowed to be heard. The moment Alicia Walker spoke, the courtroom shifted in a way no one could ignore. At first, it was subtle, a ripple of confusion, a few restrained laughs, the kind that came easily when power felt unchallenged. A child speaking out of turn was not a threat, not to people like Garrett Doyle, not in a room like this. Doyle's confidence barely flickered as he straightened his papers, already preparing to restore order with a dismissive glance. To him, Alicia Walker was an interruption, nothing more. A black child in worn clothes did not belong in the machinery of federal justice. That belief sat comfortably beneath his practiced calm, but Alicia did not sit back down. As Justice Rosalind Anderson focused on the girl, the air tightened. Procedure demanded silence. Authority demanded obedience. Yet Alicia stood still, her posture steady, her eyes fixed forward. There was no defiance in her stance, only certainty. And that certainty unsettled the room. Ethan Marlowe noticed it before anyone else did. From the defense table, he turned slightly, studying the child who had just stepped into his unraveling future. He had spent his life surrounded by professionals, lawyers, executives, advisors, people who spoke with rehearsed confidence. Alicia Walker spoke with none of that polish, yet something about her presence felt heavier, more deliberate. Justice Anderson allowed the moment to stretch. The silence itself became a test. When Alicia finally began to explain herself, the courtroom reacted not with unity but fracture. Some leaned forward, curious despite themselves. Others scoffed, exchanging glances that said the same thing without words. This was absurd. Garrett Doyle smirked openly now, secure in the belief that the system would correct this embarrassment on its own. But as Alicia continued, something began to crack. Her words were precise, not emotional, not rambling. They landed with the quiet weight of preparation. She spoke of details most people in the room had skimmed over, patterns buried beneath assumptions. With every sentence, the laughter died a little more. Garrett Doyle's confidence stiffened, his posture tightening as he listened, not because he respected her, but because he recognized the danger of unpredictability. Across the room, Landon Jefferson felt it in his chest. He had seen this pattern before, a truth emerging from someone the system never expected to listen to. Alicia Walker was saying out loud the same inconsistencies that had bothered him privately, and hearing them spoken so plainly made it impossible to dismiss them as coincidence. Veronica Cross watched silently, her expression carefully controlled. She did not react the way the others did. No laughter, no visible irritation. Instead, her eyes followed Alicia closely, measuring her. Veronica Cross understood power, and she understood threats. The danger wasn't what Alicia said, it was that people were listening. Justice Anderson's attention sharpened. She did not interrupt. She did not dismiss. She allowed the tension to build, and in doing so shifted the balance of the room. Authority had not been lost, but it was no longer predictable. Garrett Doyle finally moved, stepping forward with controlled irritation. His voice carried the edge of condescension masked as professionalism. He questioned Alicia's credibility without naming it directly, leaning on implication instead. Experience, age, qualification. The unspoken message was clear. Some voices mattered and some did not, but the attempt backfired. Alicia Walker did not react with fear or anger. She responded with clarity. And clarity in that moment was devastating. The gallery leaned in. Even those who had come expecting spectacle now sensed something deeper unfolding. Ethan Marlowe felt his isolation ease for the first time that day. Not because his situation had improved, but because someone, finally, was challenging the certainty of his guilt. And that challenge was coming from the last place anyone expected. Justice Anderson intervened, restoring order with a measured command that carried new weight. She allowed the moment to continue, not because rules had changed, but because truth demanded space. Yet beneath the surface, something darker stirred. Garrett Doyle's composure masked calculation. Veronica Cross's stillness concealed urgency. And outside the visible drama, the system began quietly pushing back against the disruption Alicia Walker had created. The courtroom had not reached a verdict, but the real conflict had already begun. And as Alicia stood there, unaware of how many eyes were now tracking her, one thing became clear. This was no longer just about Ethan Marlowe's fate. It was about what happens when the system is challenged by someone it was never built to hear. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of order. It felt like a pressure chamber. Every word Alicia Walker had spoken hung in the air, colliding with years of assumption and unchallenged authority. Justice Rosalind Anderson sat forward now, no longer observing from a distance. Her attention was sharp, deliberate, and fixed on the fragile balance unfolding before her. This was no longer routine. This was disruption. Garrett Doyle sensed it slipping. The certainty he had carried into the room, carefully rehearsed, legally fortified, was beginning to fracture. His voice, once smooth and controlled, sharpened as he pushed back harder, pressing on Alicia's age, her presence, her right to speak at all. It was not rage that drove him, but fear. Fear that the narrative he controlled was being rewritten in real time. Across the room, Ethan Marlowe felt the weight of it all pressing down. He watched as his fate was debated through implication and authority. Yet the only person truly piercing the fog was a child the system had dismissed before she ever stood up. For the first time since his arrest, he was not the center of the spectacle. And somehow, that gave him hope. Veronica Cross remained still, but stillness can scream when it hides urgency. Her eyes moved quickly toward the judge, toward the prosecutor, toward Alicia Walker. This was not how things were supposed to unfold. Systems were meant to protect people like her. Control was supposed to be invisible. Landon Jefferson felt the turning point before it happened. Years of experience had taught him that injustice rarely collapses loudly. It cracks first, quietly. And what Alicia Walker had done was create that crack. Justice Anderson raised her hand and the room fell silent. Her words were measured, but their impact was seismic. She questioned the certainty of the prosecution, not with accusation, but with logic. She demanded clarity where assumptions had stood, and in doing so she shifted the power of the moment. Garrett Doyle faltered, just for a second, but in a courtroom seconds matter. The gallery leaned forward, phones remained still. No one dared breathe too loudly. Alicia Walker stood at the center of it all, her small frame surrounded by towering systems, yet unshaken. She did not look victorious. She looked resolute. Then Justice Anderson made her decision. Not a verdict, but a pause, a break in momentum, a refusal to let the machine roll forward unchecked. The sound of her gavel echoed through the room, sharp and final. Everything stopped. Ethan Marlowe exhaled, not in relief, but in disbelief. Veronica Cross's composure finally cracked, just enough to be noticed. Garrett Doyle's confidence collapsed inward, forced into silence by the very authority he had relied on. And Alicia Walker, once invisible, once dismissed, had become impossible to ignore. As the courtroom buzzed with restrained chaos and Justice Anderson prepared to reset the course of the trial, one truth settled heavily over everyone present. This case would never return to what it was. Because once a system is challenged by truth from the margins, it can never pretend it didn't hear it. And outside that courtroom, forces far larger than Alicia Walker were already deciding what to do about her next. The days that followed changed everything the courtroom had tried to preserve. The pause ordered by Justice Rosalind Anderson was not just procedural, it became a doorway. Evidence was reviewed more carefully. Assumptions were questioned. What had once seemed inevitable began to unravel under scrutiny. The case against Ethan Marlowe no longer moved forward with confidence, but with caution. As the system slowed down, truths surfaced. Landon Jefferson's quiet concerns gained weight, supported now by the attention Alicia Walker had forced into the open. The patterns he had noticed were no longer dismissed as coincidence. They were acknowledged, investigated, taken seriously. And with that shift came consequences. Garrett Doyle's authority, once unchallenged, fractured under examination. His certainty collapsed when exposed to the same standard he had so easily imposed on others. The courtroom that once echoed with his control now reflected his silence. Veronica Cross, who had relied on invisibility through respectability, found that the system no longer shielded her movements. Power that thrives in shadows cannot survive sustained attention, and attention, once awakened, does not retreat quietly. For Ethan Marlowe, the outcome was more than legal relief. It was reckoning. He walked out of that courtroom aware that the same system that nearly consumed him had long consumed others without pause. What he had mistaken for neutrality had been comfort. What he had assumed was fairness had been distance. Seeing that truth reshaped more than his future, it reshaped his responsibility. For Alicia Walker, the moment did not end with applause or recognition. It ended with understanding. She returned to her life beside Claire Walker, carrying the same worn backpack, walking the same streets. But something fundamental had shifted. The world had listened, even briefly, and that mattered. Justice Rosalind Anderson would later reflect on the case not as an exception, but as a reminder. That justice is not threatened by young voices. It is strengthened by them. This story is not rare. It is familiar. It is repeated in different rooms, different cities, under different names. Too often, truth is ignored not because it is unclear, but because of who delivers it. Alicia Walker did not change the system by being louder than it. She changed it by being undeniable. And the question that remains is not whether injustice exists, but how many voices we will continue to overlook before we finally listen. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Black Community Struggles for more powerful stories about justice, truth, and our community's fight to be seen. And don't forget to hit the like button. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most.